There is a hotel in downtown Clearwater, Florida that has 220 rooms, 3 restaurants, a swimming pool, and a ballroom. It is 11 stories tall, faced in Mediterranean Revival stucco, and it sits on more than 2 acres at 210 South Fort Harrison Avenue, overlooking Clearwater Harbor. It opened on New Year's Eve, 1926, and in the century since, it has never once stopped operating. You cannot book a room. You cannot walk in off the street and eat in its restaurant. You cannot attend a function in its ballroom unless you have been invited by the organization that owns it. The Fort Harrison Hotel, once the civic heart of a small Florida city and the tallest building in Pinellas County, is today the flagship property of the Church of Scientology's flagged land base, and it has been closed to the general public since 1975. To understand how that happened and what it did to the city around it, you have to go back to a man named Ed Haley and the $1 million bet he placed on Clearwater when Clearwater was barely a town at all. In 1920, the city of Clearwater had a population of about 2,400 people. It sat on a bluff above a shallow harbor on Florida's Gulf Coast, named for the freshwater springs that once gurgled from the bluffs into the bay. Springs so prolific that early settlers could look down 10 or 12 feet through the water and see fish swimming on the bottom. Those springs are long gone, drained by the same human development they helped attract. The city's name is a memory of water that no longer exists in the form that gave the place its identity. Clearwater was connected to its barrier island beach by nothing more than a rickety wooden bridge that swayed in the wind and warped in the sun. The bridge had been built in 1916, and it ran 2.5 miles from the foot of Seminole Street to what was then an almost uninhabited stretch of white sand. Clearwater Beach itself had been purchased in 1897 by a man named Ernest Tate, who paid $200 for 164 acres of wilderness that would eventually be worth billions. In those early years, the beach was a day trip at best, an adventure at worst. The bridge was one lane. It had no railing in places, and at high tide the board sometimes floated. Getting to the beach was an act of faith. But Clearwater had one thing going for it that no amount of infrastructure could substitute: the weather. The city would eventually hold a Guinness World Record for 768 consecutive days of sunshine, more than 2 straight years without a single overcast day. And in the early 1920s, as the great Florida land boom gathered force, that weather became currency. People from Ohio, from New York, from Michigan arrived by train and stepped off into air that felt like a forgiveness. Advertisements in northern newspapers called the state the greatest real estate development in the world and promised that winter exists in memory only. By the mid-20s, Clearwater alone had 300 real estate agents working the town. A plot of land could change hands 10 times in a single day. Ed Haley was a local developer who understood that what Clearwater needed was not more land deals, but a building that would announce the city's arrival. He wanted a grand hotel, something that would give wealthy northern visitors a reason to stay rather than pass through on their way to Tampa or St. Petersburg. His friends cornered him and said the city was swamped. What they needed was a big commercial hotel. Haley said all right. Then he went out and gathered more than $1 million of his own money, arranged additional financing through a hotel lending concern, and commissioned the architect Robert F. Smallwood to design an 11-story tower in the Mediterranean Revival style. Stucco facades, tiled roofs, ornate ironwork, a rooftop that would catch the Gulf breeze. It would be Pinellas County's first skyscraper. They broke ground in 1925. The local newspaper ran stories about the hotel's progress as though it were a public works project, which in a sense it was. Clearwater was also building its first modern hospital, Morton Plant, and a Carnegie-funded library. Pinellas County had only existed since 1911, carved out of Hillsborough County, and Clearwater had been designated its seat. The town was building its institutions from scratch, and the Fort Harrison was the crown. The timing was almost comically bad. The Florida land boom peaked that same year and began to collapse in 1926. A devastating hurricane hit Miami in September, and the whole state's real estate market cratered. Banks failed, speculators vanished. Towns that had been platted on swampland reverted to swampland. But Ed Haley had already poured the concrete and raised the walls, and he was not the kind of man who left a building half-finished. He found the financing to see it through. On December 31st, 1926, the new Fort Harrison Hotel opened with a gala party. Guests came from across the eastern United States. A few days later, in a stunt that tells you everything about the era's appetite for spectacle, a daredevil named Henry Rowland scaled the building blindfolded. The hotel was named for Fort Harrison, a Seminole War-era Army post built in the 1830s on the bluffs south of what would become downtown. Itself named for William Henry Harrison, the general who would briefly become president. The fort was long gone, but the name stuck to the avenue, and then to the hotel, and then to the identity of the city itself. When people talked about Clearwater, they talked about the Fort Harrison. It was where the civic clubs met, where the charity balls were held, where visiting dignitaries stayed, where the community gathered during the Depression and during the war. During World War II, the military requisitioned every hotel in Clearwater to house recruits. The Fort Harrison became a barracks, its lobby full of soldiers instead of tourists, its ballroom used for drills and Christmas parties, and amateur plays staged by a squadron that happened to include a Hollywood set designer, a screenwriter, and an actor. The soldiers wrote humorous columns for the Clearwater Sun. For a few years, the Fort Harrison was the most alive it had ever been, though not in the way Ed Haley had imagined. After the war, the hotel had its most improbable owner, Ransom E. Olds, the man who invented the Oldsmobile, the man who built one of America's first automobile assembly lines, acquired the Fort Harrison by trading a racetrack for it. The details of that transaction are murky, but the result was clear. From the mid-1940s until his death in 1950, Olds ran the hotel as a kind of winter headquarters, bringing the glamour of industrial wealth to a small Gulf Coast city. Under Olds, the Fort Harrison became a stop on the circuit of grand Florida hotels, the kind of place where you dressed for dinner and danced to a live orchestra and watched the sunset over the harbor from a balcony 11 stories up. When Olds died, a postcard of the hotel still carried his name at the bottom. R. E. Olds, chairman. After Olds died, the Jack Tar Hotel chain bought the property in 1953 and modernized it. Air conditioning, an auditorium, a wing of cabanas by the pool. The hotel became looser, younger, less formal. In May 1965, the Rolling Stones, on their first American tour, played a show at Jack Russell Stadium to 3,000 fans, and then retreated to the Fort Harrison. According to the hotel's own lore, Keith Richards wrote the guitar riff for Satisfaction in a room there. Whether that is precisely true or merely approximately true, the fact that the claim exists tells you what the Fort Harrison meant to Clearwater. It was the place where things happened. Meanwhile, across the harbor, Clearwater Beach was becoming a destination in its own right. The old rickety wooden bridge had been replaced in 1927 by the Memorial Causeway, a proper two-lane drawbridge that cost so much the locals called it the $1 Million Causeway. It opened on Armistice Day, November 11, 1927, honoring local war veterans through its dedication, and it transformed the beach from an excursion into a suburb. For the first time, a visitor staying at the Fort Harrison could drive across the harbor in minutes and set foot on sand that was almost absurdly white, a quartz crystal beach that squeaked underfoot. Hotels went up along the sand. The Clearwater Beach Hotel, originally built as a private residence in 1917 by a man who had made his fortune in lumber, was converted and expanded and became a landmark in its own right. It would operate for 90 years before being demolished to make way for the Sand Pearl Resort. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Philadelphia Phillies were doing their spring training in Clearwater, and the combination of baseball, beach, and reliable sunshine made the city a genuine winter tourism destination. The population tripled, then tripled again. But here is where the two Clearwaters, the beach and the downtown, began to diverge. The beach kept growing. The downtown, perched on its bluff above the harbor, started to sag. This was not unique to Clearwater. All across America in the 1960s and 1970s, downtowns were losing ground to suburbs, to shopping malls, to the automobile and the highway. Cleveland Street, Clearwater's main commercial artery, which ran from the center of town down toward the waterfront, began to thin out. Shops closed. The grand old hotels aged. The Fort Harrison, once the social center of the city, became just another fading property in a fading downtown. By the early 1970s, it had largely fallen out of favor with visitors. The Jack Tar chain was struggling. The building needed work. The downtown around it was quiet in the wrong way. A city commission member surveyed the scene around that time and said bluntly that there was nothing to do and nothing to see. 3 years after that assessment, on a day in late 1975, a group identifying itself as the United Churches of Florida paid approximately $3 million to purchase the Fort Harrison Hotel. The name on the paperwork was a fiction. Behind it stood the Church of Scientology, which had decided that Clearwater, a city far from the scrutiny the organization was attracting in Los Angeles and Washington, would become the global headquarters for its most advanced spiritual practices. The church called it the Flag Land Base. Internally, the operation to secure it had a different name. When FBI agents raided Scientology offices in Los Angeles and Washington in 1977, among the tens of thousands of seized documents were internal blueprints for Clearwater. The plan was codenamed Project Normandy, an explicit reference to a military invasion. The man behind it was L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology's founder, who had spent the previous 8 years running the organization from a fleet of ships, the Sea Org, sailing the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean, getting expelled from port after port and country after country. Hubbard was tired of the sea. He wanted a permanent base on land, somewhere warm, near an international airport, with a large building the Sea Org could convert into a headquarters. Clearwater's declining downtown and its declining hotel fit every criterion. Along with the Fort Harrison, Scientology agents also purchased the Clearwater Bank building downtown. Within weeks, armed guards appeared at the hotel. Uniformed members of the Sea Org began walking Cleveland Street. The first person to sound the alarm was the mayor, Gabriel Cazares. Cazares was a retired Air Force officer and civil rights advocate, one of the few Hispanic elected officials in Pinellas County, a man who had belonged to the NAACP and the League of United Latin American Citizens. He had been mayor for only weeks when Scientology arrived, and he immediately grew suspicious. Why, he asked publicly, was a group from Los Angeles buying so much downtown property under a fake name? He called what was happening the occupation of Clearwater. He would later call it a paramilitary operation. Scientology's response to Cazares was extraordinary. The church declared him a suppressive person, internal jargon for an enemy, and launched a coordinated campaign to destroy his reputation and career. Internal documents would later reveal the names of these operations: the Mayor Cazares Handling Project, and, with a cruelty that was also a slur, Speedy Gonzalez. In January 1976, the church distributed a fabricated fact sheet to media, alleging dishonest conduct by Cazares and his wife. 8 days later, it sued him for $1 million for libel. But it got stranger still. In March 1976, while Cazares was visiting Washington, D.C., Scientology operatives staged a hit-and-run accident designed to frame him. A female Scientology agent drove a car in which Cazares was a passenger, deliberately struck a pedestrian, another Scientology agent, in a park, then sped from the scene and urged Cazares not to report it. The plan was to use the incident to blackmail him or destroy his political standing. Separately, other operatives planted false marriage documents in a Mexican border town to make it appear Cazares was a bigamist. They tried to manufacture a sex scandal. They infiltrated his congressional campaign staff. The stated objective in the church's own internal directive, Guardian Program Order 1398, was to remove Cazares from any position from which he can fight the expansion of Scientology. None of this was known to the public in real time. It came to light only after the 1977 FBI raids, which resulted in the conviction of 11 senior Scientology officials, including Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue, for conspiracy to steal government documents. Among the seized records were not only the Cazares operations, but the full scope of Project Normandy. The plan's stated purpose was to obtain enough data on the Clearwater area to be able to determine what groups and individuals will need to be penetrated and handled in order to establish area control. The church had placed covert agents at the local newspaper, the Clearwater Sun. One operative took a job at a law firm. Others infiltrated the state attorney's office, the Chamber of Commerce, and other civic organizations. The targets included the St. Petersburg Times, Channel 13, and the Florida Attorney General. The reporting that exposed this won the 1980 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. Betty Swenson Orsini and Charles Stafford of the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, used the FBI's court documents to reconstruct what had happened. Clearwater's residents were horrified. Over the next several years, the community rose up. Public hearings were held in 1982. There was talk of legislation, of zoning changes, of finding some way to push back. Cazares and his wife eventually sued the church for $1.5 million. The case was settled out of court in 1986, terms undisclosed. He died in 2006 at the age of 86, and his obituaries identified him, fairly, as the man who tried to warn Clearwater what was coming. But here is where the story takes a turn that the people of Clearwater in 1982 could not have anticipated. The resistance faded, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the church outlasted the outrage. Scientology had money, patience, and lawyers. It did not leave. It did not shrink. It grew. Slowly, methodically, and with an accumulation of real estate that over 4 decades would transform downtown Clearwater in ways that no zoning ordinance or public hearing could undo. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the church expanded its footprint, building by building, parcel by parcel. The Fort Harrison was renovated, not as a public hotel, but as a religious retreat exclusively for Scientologists undergoing advanced auditing, the church's signature spiritual practice, a kind of counseling session conducted with a device called an E-meter. The hotel's 220 rooms were converted for parishioners studying at the highest levels of Scientology doctrine. The pool remained, the ballroom remained, but the public was no longer welcome. Then came Lisa McPherson. On November 18, 1995, McPherson, a 36-year-old Scientologist, was involved in a minor car accident on a Clearwater street. She appeared unharmed, but began behaving erratically, removing her clothes in public. Paramedics took her to a hospital where doctors recommended psychiatric observation. Scientology is doctrinally opposed to psychiatry, and fellow church members persuaded McPherson to leave the hospital. She was taken to the Fort Harrison Hotel and placed under the care of church staffers for what Scientology described as rest and relaxation. 17 days later, on December 5, 1995, McPherson's caretakers drove her to a hospital, not the nearest hospital, but one in Newport Richey, 45 minutes away, where a Scientologist worked in the emergency room. They passed 4 closer hospitals along the way. When they arrived, McPherson had no heartbeat and was not breathing. She was pronounced dead. She had lost roughly 12 pounds. The medical examiner's report found the cause of death to be a pulmonary embolism caused by severe dehydration and prolonged bed rest. Her body bore bruises and insect bites. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. The case became international news. The state attorney's office charged the Church of Scientology with 2 felonies: abuse of a disabled adult and practicing medicine without a license. 9 years of investigations and lawsuits followed. Ultimately, the medical examiner changed the cause of death to accident, and the criminal charges were dropped. McPherson's family settled a civil suit in 2004, but the damage to the church's reputation was lasting. Protesters began gathering at the Fort Harrison Hotel every December, projecting messages onto the building's facade. In 1997, Clearwater police received over 160 emergency calls from the Fort Harrison. They were denied entry by Scientology security. The death of Lisa McPherson did not slow the church's expansion. If anything, it accelerated it. In November 1998, Scientology leader David Miscavige, who had taken control of the church after Hubbard's death in 1986, broke ground on a massive new building directly across the street from the Fort Harrison. It was called the Flag Building, though internally it was known as the Superpower Building, designed to house a secret set of spiritual exercises that Hubbard had devised in the 1970s to develop what he described as a person's 57 senses, or perceptics. The building was supposed to cost $24 million. It was supposed to open in a few years. It took 15. Construction halted in 2003 and sat dormant for years. The city assessed daily fines for code violations. By 2009, those fines totaled $245,000. In 2013, a California couple who had donated more than $420,000 to the project sued the church for fraud, alleging that the building had been kept deliberately unfinished to serve as a fundraising tool. The church denied this, offering no explanation for the delays beyond a recurring need to revise interior design schemes in an effort to get it just right. Fundraising, however, never stopped. At least $145 million was raised for a building originally budgeted at a fraction of that amount. The Flag Building finally opened on November 17, 2013, at a ceremony attended by thousands of Scientologists, including Tom Cruise and John Travolta. The building occupies an entire city block. It is 377,000 square feet, the largest building in Clearwater. Its 15-story tower is topped by a bronze Scientology cross, visible from much of the city. It is connected to the Fort Harrison Hotel by a third-story skywalk over South Fort Harrison Avenue. The two buildings, the 1926 hotel and the 2013 tower, now function as a single campus, the spiritual headquarters of a global religion, sitting in the middle of a downtown that increasingly belongs to that religion and to no one else. But it was what happened in 2017 that turned Scientology's presence in Clearwater from an uncomfortable reality into something that reshaped the city's entire future. A small piece of land, 1.4 acres, a vacant lot on Pierce Street near the waterfront, became the trigger. The lot had been owned by the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, which had planned to build a new facility there but failed to raise the money. The aquarium offered to sell the property to the city for $4.25 million, roughly its appraised value. The Church of Scientology also wanted the lot. It was adjacent to one of the church's 13-story religious retreats, and David Miscavige saw it as a natural extension of the campus. In early 2017, Miscavige held private meetings with individual city council members at the Fort Harrison Hotel. He pitched a grand vision. The church would fund an $8 million renovation of Cleveland Street storefronts, recruit high-end retail, and build an entertainment complex with the involvement of Tom Cruise. The church would spend $55 million. But there was a condition. The city had to step aside and let the church buy the aquarium lot. The city said no. In March, Miscavige raised his offer to $12.5 million. The aquarium declined, honoring its agreement with the city. Miscavige raised it again to $15 million, nearly 4 times the city's price. The aquarium said no again. On April 20th, 2017, the City Council voted unanimously to purchase the lot for $4.25 million. David Miscavige cut off communication with the city. What followed was an acquisition campaign that the Tampa Bay Times would later document in a Pulitzer-recognized 2019 investigation titled Clear Takeover. Reporter Tracy McManus and graphics journalist Eli Murray spent months reviewing more than 1,000 deeds and business records and interviewing more than 90 people. What they found was this. Between roughly 2017 and 2019, the Church of Scientology and companies controlled by its members had spent approximately $103 million buying up vast sections of downtown Clearwater, doubling the church's effective footprint. Most of the purchases were made through limited liability companies, whose ties to Scientology were not obvious from public records. Among the largest buyers were companies controlled by an Israeli businessman named Itzhak Zano, a Scientologist who spent $16.7 million acquiring 26 commercial properties downtown, nearly all in cash. By the time the Times finished its analysis, the church, its members, and entities they controlled owned 185 properties covering approximately 101 acres in the center of downtown. City leaders told the paper they had not understood the full scale of the purchases until they saw the maps. Along Cleveland Street, the main artery, the street that ran from downtown toward the waterfront, 22 of the first 33 buildings now had ties to Scientology. The buildings, once purchased, mostly just sat empty. That is the fact that changed everything about downtown Clearwater, and it is the fact that is hardest to explain through any conventional lens of real estate or business. A normal buyer purchases a commercial property because they intend to operate it, to open a store, a restaurant, a bar, an office, a hotel. They want tenants. They want revenue. They want foot traffic. What happened in Clearwater was the opposite. Properties were acquired and then shuttered. Storefronts on Cleveland Street went dark. Buildings that might have hosted restaurants, galleries, housing, or shops instead sat behind paper-covered windows. Businesses that had been there for decades, Clearwater Plumbing, Gulf Coast Marine, were displaced. 7 businesses left following the initial purchases, and more followed. The reporting suggested that the buying spree was, at least in part, a retaliatory response to the city's refusal to give Miscavige the lot he wanted. If he could not have one parcel, he would control most of the rest, ensuring that the city could never again leverage downtown property against him. A former high-ranking Scientologist told the Times that the strategy was consistent with the church's long-standing doctrine of area control. The more isolated the downtown was from non-Scientologists, the better it served the church's purposes. The practical effect was a hollowing out of the very district that Clearwater had spent decades trying to revive. Walk down Cleveland Street on a Friday at lunchtime and count the people sitting in restaurants. You will not need 2 hands. The storefronts are there, the facades are there. Some have recently been painted, but behind the glass, many are simply empty. No tables, no inventory, no signs of commerce. Just the particular blankness of a space that has been purchased and then left to wait. While cities like Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, and even smaller places like Lakeland and Newport Richey were experiencing downtown renaissances, new restaurants, new apartment buildings, new cultural venues, Clearwater's downtown remained, as one business owner described it, literally like a ghost town. The most visible people on Cleveland Street wore the uniform of the Sea Org. One developer who recently sold his office tower on Cleveland Street said the problem was not just the vacant buildings, but the psychology of vacancy. Business owners were not just leaving, they were mentally moving on, writing off downtown Clearwater as a place where normal commercial life could function. In 2023, the city opened its most ambitious attempt to break the pattern. Coachman Park, a 19-acre waterfront space at the base of the downtown bluff, was redesigned in an $84 million project that included a 9,000-seat amphitheater called The Sound, walking paths, a playground, a splash pad, a pedestrian promenade overlooking the intracoastal waterway, and cascading waterfalls along the walkway down from Cleveland Street. Cheap Trick played the opening night. Ringo Starr performed that fall. The park was genuinely beautiful, and it drew crowds. But those crowds arrived in a downtown where much of the surrounding commercial real estate was shuttered, owned by entities connected to the church. And here is the deepest irony of Clearwater's story. The beach itself has never been more popular. Clearwater Beach, across the causeway on the barrier island, remains one of the highest-rated beaches in the United States. TripAdvisor has ranked it the #1 beach in Florida. Travel and Leisure named it one of the 15 best white sand beaches in the world. In fiscal year 2024, the broader St. Pete Clearwater destination welcomed more than 15 million visitors, generating over $11 billion in economic impact and more than $96 million in tourist development tax revenue. After Hurricanes Helene and Milton damaged parts of the coast in late 2024, tourism rebounded so fast that January 2025 set a new monthly record for tax collections. By early 2026, the county was reporting back-to-back record-breaking months. The beach is thriving, the sand is still white, the sunsets are still the best on the Gulf Coast. The causeway, rebuilt in 2005 as a 6-lane modern span that cost $66 million, carries a steady stream of traffic to the barrier island every day. None of that has changed. What changed is the downtown, the gateway, the front door, the place where the causeway begins. The place where Ed Haley built his hotel, where Ransom Olds held court, where the Rolling Stones unwound after a show, where drugstores on Cleveland Street served Cokes to teenagers who honked for the car hop and spent hours parked outside. That downtown was supposed to be the bridge between the city and its beach, the place that gave Clearwater an identity beyond the sand. Instead, it became the site of the strangest real estate story in modern American history. A 50-year campaign by a single organization to acquire, hold, and in many cases simply empty the commercial heart of a city. The church disputes this characterization. Scientology officials describe the Flag Land Base as a major economic contributor, generating tourist tax revenue and employing more than 2,300 staff members. They point to the Fort Harrison's restoration, to the flag building's scale and architectural ambition, to the thousands of Scientologists who visit from more than 50 countries annually. In recent years, the church has announced plans to renovate several properties along Cleveland Street, a spa, an eyewear boutique, a French bistro, and has presented videos of an entertainment complex that it says will anchor the block. City officials have been cautiously optimistic but wary. As of mid-2026, companies with ties to the church still own more than 200 mostly empty properties in the downtown area. Council members have said repeatedly that they cannot evaluate promises without seeing plans, permits, and progress. Mark Bunker, a longtime Scientology critic who won a seat on the city council, has been the most vocal skeptic. He argues that the church's pattern, promises of development followed by years of inaction, is itself a strategy, a way to maintain control while appearing cooperative. The church has dismissed Bunker and other critics as motivated by religious bigotry. Scientology spokesperson Ben Shaw has largely declined to answer detailed questions from the press about the church's plans for its properties, about who owns them, and about when, if ever, they will be activated. In May 2026, a Cleveland Street Alliance, a group funded by the church and its parishioners, presented a promotional video describing a massive family entertainment center as a reality, even as city officials said the project had not entered formal review or received any approvals. Councilmember Lena Texera noted that the volume of messaging suggested a certainty that simply was not there. Mayor Bruce Rector said he did not know who was leading the effort or how the parties involved were connected. When economic development staff presented a list of downtown properties under renovation, the owners were listed as limited liability corporations. Staff declined to name individuals, but said the majority of investors were Church of Scientology parishioners. The disconnect is physical and visible. Drive west across the Memorial Causeway, and you arrive at a beachfront lined with high-rise hotels, seafood restaurants, souvenir shops, parasail operators, and tourists in swimsuits. Drive east across the same causeway, and you arrive at a downtown where long stretches of commercial storefronts stand quiet at midday, where the most prominent buildings belong to one organization, and where the largest structure in the city is topped with a religious symbol that has nothing to do with the beach. Clearwater is not a dying city. Its population is roughly 117,000. Its beach economy is enormous. Its new waterfront park is a genuine civic achievement. But its downtown, the blocks around Cleveland Street, the blocks around the Fort Harrison Hotel, exists in a condition that has no real parallel in American urban life. It is not blighted in the traditional sense. The buildings are not crumbling. Many have been purchased at premium prices. They are simply not being used. A city spent $84 million building a world-class waterfront park, and the street that leads to it is lined with dark storefronts owned by companies whose decision-making is opaque and whose timeline for action is perpetually unclear. Every downtown in America has a building that defines it: a hotel, a theater, a courthouse, a department store. Clearwater's was the Fort Harrison. Ed Haley gambled more than $1 million of his own money on his town at the worst possible moment, when the Florida boom was already cracking, and he finished the building anyway. His friends said the city was swamped. What they needed was a great big commercial hotel. And Haley said, all right. The local newspaper ran it as a quote years later with admiration. It was ahead of its time, but now is coming into its own, and will stand as a monument to a citizen's enterprise and civic pride. The Fort Harrison still stands. It was fully restored in 2009 and is, by all accounts, immaculate inside. It is connected by a skywalk to a $145 million building topped with a bronze cross. It sits on the avenue that bears its name in the city that once defined itself by its presence. The view from the 11th floor is the same view Ed Haley saw in 1926. The harbor, the causeway, the barrier island, the gulf beyond. The hotel is not a ruin. It is not abandoned. It is occupied every day by people who traveled from around the world to be there. It is just that the lobby where Clearwater once gathered, the ballroom where the town once danced, the rooms where an automaker and a rock band and 100 years of winter visitors once slept, none of it belongs to Clearwater anymore. On Cleveland Street, a few blocks away, a sign in the window of one of the last independent businesses reads, "Notice, this is one of the only spas in downtown Clearwater not owned by a Scientologist." The owner did not write it as a boast. It reads more like a last dispatched coordinate, the kind of message you send when you want someone to know exactly where you are.